Back in our CBS News election headquarters, let's look at that popular vote. With something over 5% of the precincts in, Kennedy is holding on to his very narrow lead, 1,860,000 votes to Nixon's 1,749,000 votes. Might be pointed out, for the first time, Kennedy has gone more than 100,000 votes ahead of Vice President Nixon this evening. Nixon jumped off to an early lead this evening, but now is holding on, just barely holding on, as Kennedy seems to be lengthening his lead. That the percentages, Kennedy has gone to 52% of that popular vote, over 48% for Vice President Nixon. He was holding 51 to 49 up until just a moment ago. In the electoral vote, Kennedy has 210 electoral votes now to Nixon's 195. Those are states in which they are leading, and of course they're very scattered returns from most of those states. Only Connecticut has been declared definitely in the Kennedy column up to this time. Let's take a look now at the eastern portion of the United States. Charles Collingwood is the major domo of the East. Charles?
Well, Walter, it looks as though pretty soon now we'll put Vermont over in the Nixon camp. With 18% in, Nixon is leading Kennedy, surprisingly narrowly, 9,000 to 7,600, but he's leading it, and that's increasing. Now we're just beginning to get some returns in from the big states as the polls in Pennsylvania have closed. Nixon is ahead in Pennsylvania as of now, but concealed in those figures are some from precincts in the city of Philadelphia, where Senator Kennedy is running better than 2-to-1 ahead of Nixon. Now the Democrats figure they'll have to come out of Philadelphia with 200 to 225,000 to carry the state of Pennsylvania, and from those little returns it looks as though Kennedy is doing very well in there. Nothing from New York yet. The polls won't close for a while. New Jersey is another very tight state in the East, and Nixon has jumped out to a lead of 12,000 to 9,000. Not very many precincts reporting, and they're coming from Republican counties like Bergen County. New Hampshire, Kennedy is ahead with 5% of the votes in. That's coming in from some of the bigger towns where there are voting machines. That is subject to change, as any result with only 5% is, of course. In Massachusetts, Senator Kennedy has bounced out to the lead, which you might expect him to do, in his own home state, 7,000 to 2,000. Maryland, Kennedy is ahead in this close state. Baltimore, these are fairly heavy returns from Baltimore, but interestingly enough, Nixon is not winning some of the counties downstate that Eisenhower won very heavily before. He's winning them, that is, by much reduced majorities. Maryland looks as though it's going to be a close one. Maine is surprisingly close. That's actually been seesawing. Nixon is ahead there, but Kennedy is close on his heels. Some more from Philadelphia, which continue to show Kennedy more than 2-to-1 ahead in the city of Philadelphia. Connecticut, the only thing interesting in Connecticut is to see how much Kennedy is going to win it by. He's about 80,000 out ahead now. Here's our first return from the big state of New York. 144 for Nixon, 66 for Kennedy. Doesn't say where it came from, and that doesn't mean much, but we'll be getting New York pretty soon, Walter.
Okay, Charles, I don't know. Maybe I was buried in some other figures here. I just had one handed to me, maybe it came up to you as you were at the board, that our correspondent down in Baltimore says that it looks as if Kennedy is going to leave Baltimore 60 to 70,000. Did you have that?
Well, I had that earlier from small returns, and that's what they figure he has to have. They figure he has to get out of there with 60,000.
60,000, so he's just about on target at the moment, eh?
Just about, and those counties, those small counties, rural counties, are going for Nixon, but by nowhere nearly as much as they went for Eisenhower.
Right. Keep an eye on it. We'll be back very shortly.
Will do.
Let's take a look at the that popular board with it climbing right close to the 2 million mark for both of the candidates. Kennedy with 1,951,978 now, and Nixon with 1,819,000. On the electoral vote, Kennedy has moved up to 250 in the states in which he is leading, just 19 short of what would be necessary if he could hold on to all of those throughout the evening to win the Electoral College count. Pennsylvania has just flopped over into the Kennedy column on the basis of the early returns from Pennsylvania with its big block of 32 electoral votes. Stuart Novins, how is the Middle West going?
Well, we're beginning to get some votes now, Walter. In Illinois, Kennedy is pulling well ahead of Nixon, but that basically is Chicago territory, Cook County territory, and the percentages on this one are very interesting because Kennedy is now approximately 69% lead over Nixon. That includes only part of Cook County, and Kennedy needs only 60%. Therefore, he's running ahead of what he needs in order to carry the state. That's the situation in Illinois. In Indiana, with still only a small part of the state reporting, 12%, you have the horse race that you see there in the presidential. Iowa, there's very little, if anything, coming in. On the Kansas vote, where we have a sizable vote, Nixon with his 96,000 approximately, and Kennedy with his 54,000. This vote includes rural and middle-sized cities, including Topeka. Wichita and Kansas City have not yet been heard from to any extent. They're basically Democratic areas. Kennedy needs 65% lead in Topeka, Wichita, and Kansas City. He's now only about 36%. So we'll have to watch that one to see what the larger cities in Kansas are going to do in the presidential race. Michigan, there's very little coming up yet. In Minnesota, very little. Missouri, very little so far, no trends established. Same thing in Nebraska. North Dakota, we have very little. In Ohio, we've got some votes. And on a basis of 7% of the precincts, you can judge what is happening by what returns have been coming out of Cuyahoga County. That's basically the Cleveland area. It's a Democratic area. It has put Kennedy in the lead, but so far not enough in the lead to carry the rest of the states. These votes include the rural suburban areas, which are Republican, basically. The Republicans say that they will be in trouble if Kennedy gets 150,000 lead over Nixon in Cuyahoga County. The Democrats insist that they have 250,000, which is more than they need, but so far we haven't seen it, so we'll have to watch that one come up. Oklahoma, most of these reports are interesting because they come from basically Democratic areas and they show Nixon in the lead. South Dakota, nothing. And in Wisconsin, Nixon is in the lead, and this is following pretty much the pattern established by Eisenhower in the last two elections. That's it, Walter.
Okay, Stu, Senator Kennedy has just gone over the 2 million mark in the popular vote. He's got 2,036,000. Nixon's 1,885,000 with more than 5% of the nation's precincts counted. It's Kennedy 250 in electoral vote, Nixon 200, no change there. A moment now for a news story from Westinghouse.
Here's exciting gift news from Westinghouse. It's the sensational new Westinghouse mixer with power to spare. It zips through the heaviest doughs and batters. It's so easy to handle. You change speeds with the flick of a thumb. And another flick of your thumb ejects the beaters for easy cleaning. What's more, the Westinghouse Power Mixer now comes with a new drink blender attachment in a new utility box for convenient storage. A great gift. And here's still more news for your Christmas giving.
Who took the handle off the old-fashioned fry pan? Who took the trouble out of storing it away? Who saw that handle wasn't pretty on the table? You know who? Why, Westinghouse, of course.
Yes, Westinghouse gave elegant buffet styling to the electric fry pan. Twin handles make this new buffet fry pan so easy to carry, easy to wash completely underwater, and easy to store. The Westinghouse buffet fry pan fries foods perfectly, roasts or bakes complete meals. See how it cooks this tempting new recipe, chicken calypso, with the new Bisquick bite-sized dumplings. Look for the Bisquick box with this picture of the buffet fry pan. Inside, there's a certificate that gives you a $3 refund on the price of your buffet fry pan. Don't miss this money-saving offer. The Westinghouse buffet fry pan makes a wonderful Christmas gift. And remember, you can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
With 6% of the votes in now, Kennedy has 2,091,000, Nixon 1,949,000. Now let's go now to Washington, D.C., to Ron Cochran at the Mayflower Hotel, the Democratic election headquarters. Ron?
Where are you going to interview with? Yeah? Why don't we leave this over there? Well, I can't get up on the podium. I have to talk from offline. Oh, yes? Where's he going to be?
If you'll tell Ron that we can hear him on that telephone, if you'll just give us his report right there. All right, Ron, we'll come back to you. We can see you there on the telephone and know that you're following the The trend of developments at the Democratic headquarters in Washington. We'll come back to you in a moment when you're off of that urgent phone call. Virginia has just flopped over into the Nixon column again for the 5th or 6th time this evening, and that gives 12 more electoral votes to Nixon. But on the other hand, Michigan has dropped over into the Kennedy column, so that the electoral vote now reads Kennedy 249 and Nixon 201. In the popular vote, Kennedy has 2,101,700 votes. Nixon has 1,952,000 votes. The percentage of that popular vote is still the same, 52% for Kennedy and 48% for Nixon. The weather today across the United States has not particularly favored this tremendously large turnout, but apparently the interest was so great in this race this year that even snow out in the Rocky Mountain states in Wyoming and in Colorado and some in the western part of Nebraska and in Minnesota couldn't keep the voters from the polls. In the Middle West it rained in some areas. In the East it has been fairly clear. And the indications are for a record vote of more than 67 million ballots cast in this 1960 presidential race to determine whether Vice President Richard Milhouse Nixon, the 47-year-old California lawyer, or John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a 43-year-old scion of the famed Kennedy family of Massachusetts, shall be the next occupant of the White House, the 34th occupant of the White House, and generally listed as the 35th president since Grover Cleveland served 2 terms, not consecutively. In the popular vote, Nixon has just reached the 2 million figure with 2,003,600. Kennedy now 2,157,900, more than 6% of the precincts counted. Let's check in with the southern tier of states and Charles Corral. Charles?
Well, Walter, as expected, Alabama and Arkansas appear to be safely in the Kennedy column on the basis of just a few scattered returns. Florida is still giving every sign of being a very close race. In Georgia, Kennedy has taken the lead. Voting in Georgia is going according to historic patterns, and it appears that Kennedy will carry that state. To give you an idea of how close this race in Kentucky really is, we've just received an almost complete vote from Louisville. The vote there now stands 106,600 for Kennedy, 106,200 for Nixon. Kentucky is still in doubt. There aren't any votes in from Louisiana yet. In Mississippi, Kennedy is running well ahead of Nixon, but the unpledged group of electors has just in the last few seconds taken a lead in Mississippi. This is the group which would like to throw this election into the House of Representatives in the event of a close vote tonight. And it's a very close lead over the Kennedy group. North Carolina appears safe for Kennedy. He's well ahead there. South Carolina has just been claimed by Senator Henry Jackson, the Democratic National Chairman, for Kennedy. They had almost given up hope of winning South Carolina, but he says, on the basis of this slim lead, that they're going to now. That may be premature. We'll have to wait and see. A lot of these states in the South are very, very close. Here's Tennessee, where Nixon has now taken a lead, but most of these votes, you have to remember, come from eastern Tennessee, the Republican section. First scattered returns are just beginning to come in from Texas. Nothing certain as yet. In Virginia, Nixon has taken the expected lead, and none of these votes yet come from Richmond, where Nixon is supposed to run very well. Finally, West Virginia, Kennedy slightly ahead. He's expected to carry West Virginia without any trouble. And that's a complete rundown on this board, Walter.
Charles, we just heard from Los Angeles, from Vice President Nixon's election night headquarters in the Ambassador Hotel out there, that his aides say he remains confident of victory on the basis of these early returns. And Pierre Solinger, the news secretary for Vice President Kennedy, says that they are very encouraged by the returns in Connecticut and grateful to the margin that the people of Connecticut have given them. Over at the IBM data center, Howard K. Smith has been wielding the whip on that IBM 7090 again. Howard, what's it telling you?
Well, Walter, I've been wielding the whip, but it hasn't been obeying me. It's been very hard indeed to predict this election, and people who've had a lot of experience in predicting say this one so far has been unusually difficult. On our graph, we've had to jump back and forth across the line from Kennedy to Nixon and back several times. so we hesitate to make a prediction now. We're going to wait until we have a few more statistics that we can rely on to distinguish a national trend. But we would like to say to people in the West where polls have not closed that the statistics here do not decide the election, only people who vote do, and we do not guarantee the results that we put out here. All we can guarantee is that the man that most of the American voters vote for will be president tomorrow. Now, there are a couple of trends from the South that our machine has computed that may be of some interest. In the South, Kennedy has been running 16% better than Al Smith did in 1928, but he has been running 3% less well than Stevenson did in 1956. Well, that's all we have here now. When we have a more solid forecast, we'll be delighted to give it to you.
Okay, Howard, let us know and we'll call you in. Vice President Nixon has just dropped to 47% of the popular vote. Kennedy has 2,385,000, as you see there. Nixon, 2,180,000. The figures going up even as we watch the board. Kennedy now 2,391,000, Nixon 2,182,000. But in the percentages, Kennedy was holding to a 52% margin of that electoral vote, of that popular vote rather, and he is now going to 53% with Nixon at 47%. In the electoral vote, it remains the same as it did some 3 or 4 minutes ago when we last read the board for you. Kennedy has 249, Nixon 201. Kennedy needs 269 for election. Nixon needs the same number, of course, 269 of the total 537 electoral votes cast by the 50 states. 6 states, as we have said earlier, reported to you, may very well hold this balance of power tonight. And here's Doug with that board again to give you a rundown of how they're going. Doug?
Right, Walter. Nothing very conclusive yet, except that at this moment, Senator Kennedy is leading in 4 of the 6, and Vice President Nixon in 1. There are a few interesting little things. Let's take Pennsylvania. Of course, the vote for Kennedy right now is coming from Philadelphia mainly, but in the first city in Pennsylvania to report today, the city of Titusville, the vote gave Nixon about 1,900 votes to 1,100 for Kennedy. The Nixon majority of 800 is 709 less than President Eisenhower's lead. And I hear you'd like to have it back over there, Walter. That's what they tell me anyway. If you're not ready, I can continue.
As a matter of fact, Doug, I don't have anything at this moment to report, so go right ahead.
All right. Well, that's for Pennsylvania, and we'll be watching that because that vote will swell all during the evening. 5% of the votes are supposed to be in the state of Illinois. Most of them, of course, are from Cook County, as you've already heard, Chicago. Kennedy is leading by about 70% of that vote. He needed only 60 to be reasonably sure, according to the Democrats, of carrying the state of Illinois. But these returns are fractional, and it remains to be seen whether they will continue as the downstate votes from Illinois begin to come in. And generally, they are reasonably Republican. In the state of Ohio, 7% of the votes are in, and the situation there, of course, is that the votes are coming from Cleveland mainly and other scattered precincts throughout the state. In Franklin County, which is the county of Columbus, there is a very heavy vote, and it's slowing down the count. Now, Franklin County in Ohio normally is more Republican than the rest of the state. If Nixon gets 55% of the vote in Franklin County, it's a good sign for him in Ohio. What about Texas? The vote there, about 4% of the state of Texas is in. The Democrats now have 59% of that vote, and they've claimed that they'd get 53%. If they got it, well, that would be enough. But that's only 4%. They say they're ahead, and things look good at this moment. In Illinois, very scattered returns from upstate, and they show that the electoral votes go for Nixon here at this moment. Nothing decisive, of course. Now back to Walter Cronkite.
And now I have something, Doug. From Hyannisport, Bobby Kennedy, who has been helping manage the campaign of his brother for the presidency, just told Sam Jaffe, a CBS correspondent, that he thinks things look very good, I must say. And from Puerto Rico, I report that Governor Luis Muñoz Marin, whose party was condemned by the Catholic Church in Puerto Rico, has taken a long lead toward another term in office as governor of Puerto Rico in the early returns from that province. We'll have more reports as they come in from across the nation right after we hear from Fred Davis speaking for Westinghouse.
I'd like to show you how Westinghouse equipment opens and closes the largest movable roof in the world. This is a model of the new Pittsburgh Public Auditorium. In good weather, it's open to the stars and the summer breeze. When bad weather hits, look, the arena becomes a snug indoor auditorium. Now, thanks to Westinghouse equipment, there will be no canceled performances, no umbrellas, no wet, shivering spectators. For the roof of the Pittsburgh Auditorium will be the biggest umbrella in the world. Now, let's look at the actual auditorium. As you can see, the dome is now being erected. When completed, the arena will seat about 14,000 persons. It'll be used for concerts, conventions, light opera, and sporting events. Now, let's try a little camera magic. Each of the 6 movable sections rolls on steel tracks and is powered by 5 Westinghouse gear motors. Westinghouse control systems handle the entire operation of the roof. This Westinghouse system is so efficient that one touch of a button will open or close the 1,350-ton roof in just 2.5 minutes, even in 60-mile winds. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
The United Press has just given the state of Massachusetts to Senator John Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, with its 16 electoral votes in Massachusetts. His home state was anticipated to go for Kennedy, and the Republicans have never claimed that they had even any hope of carrying that state. Let's go down now to the Democratic Convention headquarters in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, where this time I believe Ron Cochran is available for us. Ron?
Yes, Walter, I have Senator Jackson here, the Democratic National Chairman. Senator, are there some surprises in tonight's results?
No, not so far. I would say that Connecticut might be a partial surprise. We felt that we would be carrying Connecticut by a little over 30,000. It now appears we're going to carry it from 75 to 100,000.
You think you're going to win?
We're going to win, Ron. The real meaning of Connecticut is that we're going to run strong in the big industrial states. And if you add up the electoral votes in the big industrial states, you have enough to win. And the real meaning of Connecticut is that with the margin that we're piling up in Connecticut, we're going to carry the industrial states. That means victory. That means Senator Kennedy is the next president of the United States.
How long do you think it's going to be before we get the conclusive results, Senator?
I think we should know by, say, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time.
How do you feel your man's going to do in the South?
He's doing fine in the South. He's going to carry, for example, South Carolina. We're behind now, but the rural vote's not in. We're doing well in North Carolina. I was confident we would carry North Carolina. We're going to carry Florida. So we're pleased with the results so far out of the South.
And what about New York State?
He'll carry New York State by a good margin.
And Pennsylvania?
We just had a report from Congressman Bill Green, the chairman in Philadelphia. He indicates that we're carrying Philadelphia around 200,000, which is more than ample to carry Pennsylvania for Senator Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Senator Jackson. And now back to Walter Cronkite.
And on the popular count, 7% of the precincts have now been counted across the states, a little bit more than 7%, to give Kennedy 2,603,000, Nixon 2,417,000. And on the electoral vote, Kennedy has moved up to 253 with the addition of the first returns from South Dakota, giving him 4 electoral votes. So he now shows with 253 electoral votes to the 204 electoral votes for Nixon. All of these, except in Connecticut, are on the basis of very scattered returns. As we said, the United Press is giving Massachusetts to Kennedy, but that's on the basis of scarcely 1% of the vote in Massachusetts, although the state is almost certainly included in the Kennedy column. The percentage of vote is 52% for Kennedy now, 48% for Nixon. In the race for the Senate of the Senate in the Congress meeting in January, Democrats now lead in states that would give them 17 Senate seats. That's in 4 more than the 13 fairly safe southern and border seats that they counted on. The Republicans lead in states that would give them 9 Senate seats in the makeup of the new Senate. If that holds throughout the evening, we can credit 32 seats in the new Senate to the Republicans and 61 seats to the Democrats in that new Senate meeting in January. We'll be continuing our national election coverage, but now let's pause for the latest local returns across the nation. And for those of us who are remaining, those of you who are remaining with us, those of us who are remaining with you too, let's take a look now at the West Board with Grant Holcomb. Grant?
Well, Walter, just a dab of returns here, because in some parts of the West, way out there in Nome, Alaska, they'll be voting for another 5 hours, at least have the opportunity to. But we do have reports from 7 of the 13 western states, and this is the situation in those 7 states where we have the returns. Let's start first with California. Vice President Nixon leading by just 1 vote. The most interesting set of returns that we have so far over here in Colorado. At this hour in 1956, Eisenhower was leading Stevenson by just 100 votes in Colorado. We had at that time only 2,500 votes in. Eisenhower had 1,400 votes. Stevenson, 1,300 votes in Colorado at 9 o'clock, just about the same time, 1956. Now let's move down 2 panels to the state of Idaho and then take a quick look at some of the other panels. As you can see, Nixon is leading Kennedy by just 1 vote, but let's take a look at this Idaho report because it's very interesting. It comes from the same precinct that in 1956 voted overwhelmingly for President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower in 1956 from this Idaho precinct received 26 votes. This time split almost even, Vice President Nixon getting the 1 vote. Now, over on the next panel, Montana, it's 4 electoral votes. Nixon leading there by 2. That's the first report we've had from Montana. Next to it, Nevada. Nevada is a Kennedy state at this moment, 57 votes more than Vice President Nixon. Incidentally, some of those votes for Senator Kennedy come from a town in Nevada called Nixon. It's a town that's on a Paiute Indian reservation, and the Paiute Indians in Nevada, on this reservation at the town of Nixon, gave their votes to Kennedy. Next to Nevada, the state of New Mexico, and there is one where Vice President Nixon is leading by 69 votes. Nothing in from Oregon yet, but let's go down 2 panels to the state of Utah. In the state of Utah, it is Vice President Nixon leading Kennedy by 4 votes. Now, those are all of the returns that we have in from the West at the present time. The voting out there will continue, especially in the big state of California, for another hour until 7 o'clock in most of the state, until 8 o'clock in San Francisco. The polls close in San Francisco at 8 o'clock, but San Francisco is one of 2 counties in California that manages to get its entire vote on voting machines, so we will have some very rapid returns from San Francisco once the polls close there. We also are looking for some rapid returns very shortly from the state of Arizona. Arizona has better than half the state on voting machines in the county of Maricopa County and in the county of Pima. Voting machines, and those are the 2 most populous counties in Arizona. And that's the story in the West.
Stay tuned for more election returns on the CBS television network.
Back at CBS News election headquarters, where we have just posted 8% of the precincts, moving up toward that 10% mark in the nation. And Kennedy is holding on to his lead and has moved more than 200,000 votes into the lead. 3,017,000 votes for Kennedy, 2,759,000, almost 760,000 votes for Nixon, with 8% of the precincts counted. However, Ohio has flopped back into the Nixon column, so that in the electoral vote it's much closer. As a matter of fact, Nixon has moved back ahead with 229 electoral votes in the states where he is leading, with Kennedy 228 votes in the states where he is leading. The percentages remain the same. Kennedy 53% of the popular vote, and Nixon 47% of the popular vote. At this hour, 9 p.m. in 1956, Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, had 56% of the votes. That's compared to Nixon's 47%. Stevenson had 44% of the votes. That's compared with Kennedy's 53% of the votes. Let's check back with the IBM 7090 and Howard K. Smith. Howard, how does it look to you now?
Well, Walter, the crystal ball has been cloudy, but now it seems to be clearing up a great deal. Our forecast has been switching back and forth between the two candidates, but now we've established a trend, and we think now we're close to being right. At 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, with 7% of the nation's precincts reporting, the odds are 49-1 on the election of John F. Kennedy as president. The forecast at this time gives Kennedy 325 electoral votes, Nixon 212. That is, we expect by the end of the evening that Kennedy will have 312 electoral votes to Nixon's 212. As you know, 269 are needed to elect. In regard to popular vote, Nixon, we forecast now, will get 48% of the popular vote, Kennedy 52%. And insofar as we can estimate the number of states each will get, Kennedy, we forecast, will have 30 states to Nixon's 20. That is a little more stable than the forecast we've given you before. We hope that future ones will be even more so. Back now to the anchor desk.
Well, whether it's Kennedy or Nixon, Howard, as we know, this is a precedent-shattering election. The next president will establish precedent. He'll be the youngest president in 50 years, regardless of how it goes. And if it's Kennedy, the youngest, but by a year, the second youngest, younger than Theodore Roosevelt when he moved into the presidency after McKinley was assassinated. He was only 42 years old at the time. Kennedy will be the youngest man ever elected to the presidency if these returns carry out the fact that he is to be the next president of the United States. Stuart Novins, how are things looking in the Middle West?
Well, let's take a look at Illinois, Walter. In this situation, the big Cook County vote is coming in very, very rapidly. We've got 6% of the total state vote, and this really is a contest between conservatism, political conservatism, downstate in Illinois, and probably what is the best Democratic machine in the United States. That's the one around Chicago, which is run basically by Mayor Daley of Chicago. Kennedy is being helped in the state here by a very strong support from Senator Douglas and also from Kerner, who's running against an apparently weak incumbent Governor Stratton. In Indiana, Nixon is running well ahead of Kennedy. We've just been on the telephone to some of the key professional people in Indiana, and they say there appears now to be very little question about what's going to happen to the state, that Nixon has it. Some of the other state races possibly could go Democratic. In Ohio, as we move down, Ohio with its 25 electoral votes, Kennedy is leading, as you can see from the figures on the board. Those figures started in the Cleveland area and Cuyahoga County. The returns now include heavy Democratic areas. In Mahoning County, that's Youngstown Steel area, where there's a very high degree of unemployment, which normally would go to Kennedy, but that still is a very definite contest. In Cuyahoga County, Kennedy has 74%. It was figured that if he got 60% of that, he'd be all right. So he appears to be all right at the moment, but certainly nobody is going to make any concessions in Ohio for a long time to come tonight. That about wraps it up here. The rest of the figures are very small, very insignificant, really, in terms of the precincts which have been returned, Walter.
Kennedy's just holding on to that 200,000 lead. As you see on the board, it's switching every few seconds, but 3,203,000 for Kennedy now, 2,923,000 for Nixon. And in these last figures just posted, it's stretching the Kennedy lead just a small bit. There's another posting for 3,236,000 for Kennedy with 2,956,000 for Nixon, and the Kennedy lead has stretched just a mite there. Kennedy now has 253 electoral votes, with Ohio just having popped back into the Kennedy column with 25 electoral votes to give him the 253. Nixon 204 of the 269 needed. And now for Betty Furness and something new from Westinghouse.
If you think miniature radios have to have a miniature sound, you haven't heard the new Westinghouse 7-transistor pocket radio. Westinghouse puts big set quality into this tiny transistor. Now, everything you see on this board fits into this tiny radio. All the components are American made, which means quality made, and are put together with all the skill you expect from Westinghouse. That's why there's big set quality in this tiny transistor. Compare it with other miniatures. You'll see and hear a big difference. There's long battery life, too, up to 75 hours on 2 small pen-light batteries available anywhere. Ask your local dealer for the new Westinghouse 7-transistor pocket radio, also available in this handsome gift pack. And see all the other Westinghouse radios and phonographs. And now, here's more news from Westinghouse.
Better looking, new shape. New light with Westinghouse white eye-saving bulbs. Millions of tiny filter particles give you the best light for seeing ever developed. It's the only modern light bulb in 35 years. Makes every fixture look better. Remember, Westinghouse white eye-saving bulbs. 60, 75, or 100 watts, 2 for only 58 cents. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
We just heard from Vice President Nixon's headquarters out in Los Angeles, where his news secretary, Herb Klein, says that these returns are going about as they had anticipated in the early stage of the evening. That is, a heavier Kennedy vote from the eastern part of the country, which reports generally first. His quotation was, "Our study of bellwether areas to this point shows no more advantage to one candidate than the other." The states that we now show in the Kennedy column are Alabama, Arkansas, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, which is a surprise so far. These are very scattered returns, we remind you, but Illinois is expected to be in the Nixon column by at least the Nixon forces. Massachusetts, which is no surprise. Michigan, Minnesota, where Nixon was expected to run particularly strong. Very scattered returns there. Mississippi, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, big blocks of votes there. South Carolina, where Nixon had been expected to make inroads in the solid South. South Dakota, Texas, and West Virginia. Nixon leads in 22 states: Colorado, Delaware, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, with the biggest block of electoral votes in the nation, 45, North Dakota, Oklahoma, which was expected, Rhode Island, where Kennedy was expected to take the state, Tennessee, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, and Wisconsin. We point out again, these are very scattered returns, although we've just had the 9% figure go up on our IBM tabulating board. 9% of the popular vote in. Nixon, 3,065,000. Kennedy, 3,397,000. So with 9% of the precincts in, Kennedy has passed the 300,000 mark in his margin over Vice President Nixon. In the electoral vote, Kennedy also is climbing toward that magic figure of 269 on the basis of these very early returns. 266 electoral votes for Kennedy. That includes the 13 that have just switched over from Missouri to the Kennedy column. And in addition of the first returns from California, 32 electoral votes, but they have gone into the Nixon column to give him 223. Let's take a closer look now at the eastern part of the United States and Charles Collingwood. Charles?
Walter, we're going to have some close ones here in the east. Now you take Pennsylvania. We've got 11% in from Pennsylvania, which shows Senator Kennedy with more than 100,000 lead over Vice President Nixon. Most of those returns are coming in from Philadelphia. Philadelphia is going to give Kennedy a big majority. They're voting better than 2-1 for Kennedy right now. But there are some danger signals for the Democrats in Pennsylvania, because some of those middle counties where it was felt the religious issue might be a factor are going heavily for Vice President Nixon. They haven't come in yet. Now, New York, well, we haven't really got enough to talk about New York. We got 3 less than 400 votes for each one. Kennedy's a little ahead, but that doesn't mean anything. New Jersey. Now here's another real horse race here in the East. As of now, Vice President Nixon is ahead with 151,000, Kennedy with 128,000. Those are mixed returns. They're coming from predominantly Republican Bergen County and from predominantly Democratic Hudson County, and that is still very much of a horse race. Incidentally, Senator Case, the Republican incumbent, is running well ahead of his opponent, Mr. Lord, 120,000 to 86,000, with 9% of the votes in. Now, New Hampshire. This is an interesting state because most of the pollsters and experts were giving New Hampshire to Senator Kennedy, but with 10% of the precincts in, mostly from cities, to be sure, Senator Kennedy is running almost 2-to-1 ahead of Vice President Nixon. That's going to be an interesting one to watch. Massachusetts, well, we gave Massachusetts to Senator Kennedy. It's 3-to-1 now, only 4% of the precincts, but that's his home state, and everyone really concedes that to him. But Maryland is a very close one. Vice President Nixon is now ahead in Maryland, 177,000 to 165,000, but that's close, even though 38% of the precincts are in. It figured to be close, and it really is. Maine, Nixon has gone out well in front in Maine. Delaware is a standoff now with 1% in. They had trouble in Delaware. They had so many people at the polls, they had to keep the polls open longer in some places. Connecticut, Kennedy is now something like nearly 80,000 votes ahead of Nixon. 2 congressional races decided in Connecticut. The at-large seat, the Democrat held it, and the Democrat lost the 4th seat in the 4th district in Connecticut. That's 1 loss in the House for the Democrats from Connecticut. That's the way it looks here, Walter.
Okay, Charles, a switch of the New York's 45 big electoral votes over into the Kennedy column on the basis of these very scattered returns puts Kennedy over the 269 electoral votes he would need for election if all of these stay with him throughout the evening to 301 electoral votes. Nixon has 188. Of course, these are based on very scattered returns from many of the states. Very few of the states are anywhere near complete enough to make a firm prediction at this moment. We've just had a change on the electoral board. Let's take another look at it. We're getting a change in Texas, where Texas has switched out of the Kennedy column into the Nixon column with its 24 electoral votes on the basis of a few scattered returns just in. So Kennedy now has 277 and Nixon 212. The machines, with their tubes going like fury, are almost faster than we humans can report these figures. Keeping an eye on these electronic boards is like watching a marble machine gone wild. The percentage of the vote still stands at 53% for Kennedy and 47% for Nixon. Down in Washington, D.C., just a short while ago, you saw President Eisenhower arrive at the Republican election night headquarters at the Sheraton Park Hotel. He made a statement to Republican workers there gathered, and here are excerpts from the Eisenhower statement by tape.
Now, I came here tonight just for one purpose, to thank all of you. To thank you, first of all, for your concern for the United States, a concern that would not let you say, I am merely going to register my opinion on November 8th, that I'm going to work to try to make other people see what this is all about, this election for America today, for you that are now mature, you that are young, for those that are coming after us, your children and grandchildren, for those of you who are as bald as I am or white. Now, in saying thank you for what you've done, I'm also mindful there are still people working, because some of the polls in this eastern sector, they tell me, don't close until 9 o'clock, and of course in California, we're some 3 hours ahead of it. My friends, the only way that battles are won is keep them fighting right to the last minute. And they've got everything to fight for.
Popular vote, 10% of the precincts counted now. Kennedy's lead has stretched to almost 400,000, 3,712,000 votes he counts. Nixon counts to 3,343,000 votes. Kennedy, incidentally, was said to have jumped with joy when he heard the Connecticut returns, thinks those are indicative, undoubtedly. He had dinner tonight with Mr. and Mrs. Morton Downey and Carol Rosenblum, Casey Billings, his old roommate from Choate School. After dinner, went over to Bobby Kennedy's command post up there at Hyannisport, Massachusetts, where he'll be watching the returns for some time, apparently. Let's take a look at the southern portions of the United States now with Charles Kuralt again. Charles, come in.
Well, the story in the South is still a story of very close and undecided races. I cite Virginia and Texas. These very few of the Texas precincts are in as yet, but this is about as close a race as you can have. 50 votes separate Nixon and Kennedy in that state. In Tennessee, Nixon appears to be taking a more commanding lead as the vote comes in from central Tennessee. He's ahead some 18,000 votes there, but we'll still have to wait and see about Tennessee. South Carolina is the first big dent of Kennedy in what the Republicans hoped would be the beginnings of a real two-party South. They had every hope of carrying South Carolina, but on the basis of these returns and the fact that the returns are still to come in from the Piedmont section of the state in large measure, that's Kennedy country, Kennedy we have registered as carrying South Carolina. He's also obviously going to carry North Carolina in easy style. In Mississippi, the unpledged electors are still running well ahead of either the Kennedy or Nixon slates, and it appears apparent now, as the returns come in from the big cities, that the unpledged group of electors will carry the state of Mississippi. In the event of a close election, this could be an interesting state to watch. Louisiana's first returns are in, and once again, 234 to 234, a tie with less than 1% of the state's precincts reporting. I suppose this might be a place to stop for a moment and ponder the close returns that we're having everywhere in the South. It's going to be very early in the morning before we, or should I say late in the morning, before we really know anything. But before I go, I want to point out Kentucky, where Nixon has taken what appears to be a commanding lead now. Our field telephone reporter in Kentucky said the Democrats are very gloomy in that state. They haven't conceded anything, but it appears apparent that Nixon is well ahead with 42% of the precincts in. And that's the story as it stands right now in the southern United States.
Charles, I believe I'm right, am I not, that unpledged slate of electors in Mississippi, it is believed, will cast their votes for the Democratic candidate if it seems that he's going to get in regardless of that situation, and that they're only unpledged really in case of a close race. Is that right?
Well, they've been pretty close-mouthed about it, as a matter of fact, Walter. It's assumed that if Kennedy carries the nation by a wide margin, they'll fall into the Kennedy column. What they're hoping for, of course, is a chance to throw this election into the House of Representatives or bargain with Kennedy or Nixon.
By the way, Charles, you might check with your regional editors down there for the South. The IBM tabulator just comes in and says that Kennedy or Nixon rather, has gone back into the lead in South Carolina. 152,800 now to 147,000 for Kennedy.
That's the story of this southern region tonight, Walter. We've registered him elected on the basis of the fact that Spartanburg and Greenville and some of those South Carolina cities, which always go heavily Democratic, haven't reported yet. And the religious issue, by the way, doesn't seem to be cutting into the Kennedy total in the South in anything like the degree that was expected. But we'll check it.
Okay, right, Charles. We'll be back to you shortly. But now Betty Furness brings us another interesting piece of news from Westinghouse.
Here's a brand new appliance from Westinghouse to make floor care easy for you.
This beautiful floor is proof that the new Westinghouse Scrubber Polisher makes any floor look better faster. This old-fashioned polisher splatters when it scrubs, but the new Westinghouse scrubs clean without splatter. Old-fashioned polishers leave swirl marks and streaks when they polish, but the new Westinghouse polishes floors to a satin-smooth finish without leaving swirl marks or streaks. It's so easy to use, even a child can run it. That's because it works on a brand new principle. Its large double-action brush swings in a wide orbit as it revolves, covering more floor area faster. Compare. Before you buy any polisher, try it. See the great new Westinghouse Scrubber Polisher at your Westinghouse dealers now. And here's more news from Westinghouse about easy house cleaning. New from Westinghouse, 2 vacuum cleaners in 1. It's the Westinghouse Spin Jet Vacuum Cleaner. 2 cleaners in 1. A canister for easy cleaning of furniture, drapes, and blinds. And now, for the heavy-duty cleaning power you need for rugs, Westinghouse gives you upright beating action with a new revolving brush to pick up deep down dirt and annoying lint and threads. Buy the new Westinghouse Spin Jet today.
33 electrovolts have just popped over from the Kennedy column to the Nixon column, putting Nixon ahead in electoral votes at the moment, 255 to 248 for Kennedy. The 2 states that have gone back into the Nixon column are South Carolina, as reported just a moment ago, and Ohio with its considerable block of 25 electoral votes. So that Nixon is ahead in electoral votes. However, in the popular vote, with now 11% of the precincts counted, that number 11 just popped up there as you saw. Kennedy is holding on to around a 300,000 vote lead, 4,149,000, almost 4,150,000 to Nixon's 3,796,000 votes. The percentage is still Kennedy 53 and Nixon 47 of the popular vote. Grant Holcomb, how are things going out there where America crosses the Rockies and meets the Pacific? And how do you like that for a lovely lead-in? You can't complain about that one.
I wish I could respond, Walter, with a lovely scattering of returns, but I can't. I do have some late returns, the first returns that we've taken a look at this evening from Arizona. And you will notice that Kennedy is leading the vice president by approximately 400 votes. Now, the interesting thing about that, Walter, is that in 1956, at this hour, President Eisenhower was leading Adlai Stevenson in Arizona by 100 votes. Now, this year, 4 years later, it is Kennedy leading Nixon by 400 votes. These votes in Arizona, incidentally, come from the Phoenix area in Maricopa County. I was just handed another report from Arizona. It hasn't been posted on the board yet, and that shows that Nixon, 12,000 votes, Kennedy, 11,000 votes in Arizona. This report from 22 of 654 precincts. Again, these votes are from Maricopa County, and that's the county that Nixon is counting on very heavily. He has to win in Maricopa County to win in the state of Arizona. We have one report just down 2 panels on the race for governor in Arizona, and the incumbent Republican Paul Fannin has a substantial lead on the basis of these few returns over Lee Ackerman of Phoenix, Arizona. Mr. Ackerman is quite a fabulous young man. He's 39 years of age. Back in 1947, he was working as a $50 a week reporter on the Arizona Republic. Now he is president of approximately 15 Arizona firms doing approximately $50 million worth of business a year. Walter, that's the way it looks, at least in Arizona. Let's go back over to you and take a look at some of those other figures.
Well, we just had a switch in electoral vote that balances itself out. Rhode Island crossed from the Nixon into the Kennedy column, where everybody had expected it to be all along, giving Kennedy 4 electoral votes and taking those from Nixon. But Arizona, on the other hand, as you reported, crossed from Kennedy into the Nixon column. That's also 4 electoral votes, so it stands Nixon 255, Kennedy 248. However, Kennedy is stretching his popular vote with more than 11% of the precincts counted. Kennedy now has more than a 400,000 vote lead, 4,440,000 to Nixon's 3,995,000. Barely got that one out before the machine caught up with me, but the percentages are the same, 47 to 53 for Kennedy. We'll be continuing our national election coverage, but now let's pause for the latest local returns across the nation. And while we're waiting, let's hear from, now let's see, who we got ready up here on the board. We'll take a look around. David Schomburn. David, are you over there in the what we have called our brain box, where Eric Severide and you, Doug Edwards, are presiding this evening? David Schomburn?
Good evening. While the returns have been coming in from around the country, we've been on the telephone calling around the world to find out what people overseas think of our elections and also to find out what's been happening in the outside world while we've been voting here in America. Well, Americans from Harry's New York bar in Paris to the diplomatic compounds in Moscow have been listening in to election returns at all-night parties. Of course, our European allies are interested too. Tomorrow morning, the BBC is opening its radio service a half hour earlier than usual, while BBC television is opening up at 6:30 a.m. London time, and that's 3.5 hours earlier than usual to give the British people the returns on the American elections. From Rome, CBS News correspondent Winston Burdett reports that the Italian people are immensely interested in this election. Many of their relatives live in this country, and naturally they wonder, like the British, the French, and the West Germans, just who the young leader of the most powerful state in the Western Alliance will be. So far as they are concerned, both Nixon and Kennedy are young men. The Russian press so far is making no mention of the election, but communist China is ridiculing the whole procedure. They're saying that no matter who wins, he will be the tool of monopoly capitalism. It wouldn't be surprising if later on Moscow radio does not adopt the same line. In fact, Pravda just a few days back said practically the same thing, condemning Kennedy and Nixon both. Unrest is growing tonight in France and in Algeria. Yesterday, the deputy to Algeria's delegate general, Mr. André Jacomet, resigned in protest against de Gaulle's espousal of an Algeria, that is, self-governing territory. Now, several more senior officials have offered their resignations, and there are reports that once more the French army may become involved. The army wants to keep Algeria part of France. In London, the United States and Britain and the West Indies have issued a joint communique dealing with the question of American military bases on West Indian soil. The communique says that the United States is willing unconditionally to give up the major part of the base's area that it controls in the West Indies. These are the bases, you may remember, that we obtained in 1941 as part of that deal with Great Britain in which we traded those 50 overage destroyers for the right to maintain bases in the West Indies under the terms of a 99-year lease. The communique does not mention these bases specifically. It says, and I quote, "Representatives of the United States declared their readiness to release unconditionally the major part of the areas which they hold at present under the 1941 agreement." This communique covers only the initial phase of the talks which are being held in London. The second phase of the talks will be held later in the individual West Indian territories themselves. The president of the Congo, Joseph Kasavubu, made a dramatic appeal today before the United Nations General Assembly here in New York. He demanded that a delegation led by himself and not by his rival Patrice Lumumba be seated in the assembly and that it be recognized as representing people in the Congo. That's the world news as of this moment.
Stay tuned for more election returns on the CBS Television Network.
This is Walter Cronkite back in CBS News election headquarters in New York City. where we can report that nearly 12.5% of the nation's precincts have now been counted here by our IBM tabulating machine, and shows Kennedy still moving out ahead. With almost every tabulation, he extends his margin. He now has 4,849,000, Nixon 4,296,000. And Kennedy's electoral vote has again climbed well over the 269 he would need for election if he can keep all of these votes in his column, and it's doubtful that he can keep all of them, at least exactly as arranged now, inasmuch as these are very scattered returns from many states. But Kennedy has 305 electoral votes, Nixon 208 as the states now line up. This includes some new additions. Delaware has just shifted over to Kennedy. Kentucky has come in with its first returns for Kennedy, and New Jersey's big 25 votes have flopped over again this evening into the Kennedy column. There are some other reports in that indicate the magnitude of the Kennedy vote at the moment. Almost half of the 84 precincts reported in from New York State are from the city of Syracuse that the Republicans hope to carry by a 25,000 vote margin, and yet Kennedy is leading there 27,000 to 24,000. That's in New York State. In Illinois, our man in Chicago, Bernie Eisman, says that the City News Bureau is now projecting that Kennedy will win the state of Illinois by 90 to 100,000 votes, a state that had been considered a toss-up, but that the Republicans had high hopes of taking. Let's see how our IBM 7090 machine looks at the figures as interpreted now by Howard K. Smith. Howard?
The odds have dropped. Walter, we're just working on the machine here, and at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with 11% of the nation's precincts reporting, the odds are 13 to 5 that Kennedy will win the election. We're still computing what percentage of the popular vote he will have and what electoral vote he will have. Meanwhile, we've induced the computer to tell us how Kennedy is doing compared to Governor Stevenson in 1956. And the national picture is that Kennedy is doing 6% better than Stevenson. In the South, Kennedy is doing exactly the same as Stevenson did. In the Midwest, where we have just a few results, 8% better than Stevenson, Kennedy is doing. In New England, with a scattering of results, Kennedy is doing 31% better than Stevenson did. So now at 9:30, with 11% of the nation's precincts voting, it is still John F. Kennedy forecast here to be the next president. Back now to the anchor desk.
Well, Howard, we may be able to confuse these machines yet, although so far we haven't been able to. But South Carolina just almost did it by reporting an exact tie at this point in South Carolina. 152,827 votes for Nixon, 152,827 votes for Kennedy. So the South Carolina vote somehow or other is being balanced on that board, and I don't quite know in which electoral column it is, but that is such an unusual feature that I'm sure we don't have to worry about it. Right now, though, Kennedy has 300 electoral votes and Nixon 213, and on that popular count, 5 million votes for Kennedy, 4,500,000 for Nixon. Kennedy has moved past the 500,000 mark, 500,000 mark in his margin over Vice President Nixon at this stage in the evening. The precedents that will be broken this evening, the youngest man to be elected to the presidency in 50 years since Theodore Roosevelt in 1908, as a matter of fact, will be coming to the White House regardless of which of these men win. Nixon is 47 and Kennedy just 43. Be the first man born in the 20th century to occupy the White House, and we're running a little behind the 19th century. The 19th managed to elect their first president born in the century in 1850, but he just barely made it. He was born in January of 1800. Let's go to the East board now and see how those states are lining up as Charles Collingwood has them tabulated. Charles?
Well, the votes are beginning to come in, Walter. Let's start with New York State, crucial state here. There are only 1% of the districts reported. Kennedy has a lead of 54,000 to Nixon's 47,000. But although there are only about 1% in, they're extremely important because of where they come from. Most of them are coming from upstate, which is usually Republican territory. Senator Kennedy has carried the indicator town of Rome, New York, by over 2,700 votes. Last time, 4 years ago, Eisenhower carried it by 5,000 votes, and Democrats in New York are jubilant because they think that this means that Kennedy's prospects are very good upstate as well as in New York City. We haven't had many votes from New York City, but Syracuse is slightly in the Kennedy column now. Let's take another look at Pennsylvania, where Kennedy, with 21% of the precincts in, is lengthening his lead over 250,000 by now. He's going to come out of Philadelphia with something like 250,000, which under normal circumstances is enough for him to carry the state, and most people are beginning to think he will. Another big state with its 16 electoral votes is New Jersey. They've got a little more than 20% in, and Kennedy is now ahead by about 10,000 votes. And the New York Star-Ledger, in its first edition tonight, reported that all indications are that Kennedy will carry it. He's just lengthened his lead by a return which was just handed to me and which hasn't been posted yet. Kennedy, 321,000. Nixon, 294,000. Looking down here at New Hampshire, Kennedy still maintains a lead in New Hampshire, and the city of Portsmouth, which usually goes Republican by something like 2 or 2.5 to 1, has gone for Senator Kennedy by 461 votes. In other words, the Kennedy strength in the East seems to be increasing as the votes come in. That's true, of course, in Massachusetts, his own state. In Maryland, though, it is a real horse race. Kennedy's behind now. Vice President Nixon is ahead by some 7,000 votes. However, a good part of the city of Baltimore has not yet reported. And Baltimore is delivering for Kennedy the largest majority which it has delivered for any presidential candidate in recent history. Kennedy will come out of Baltimore City with something like 65,000 vote majority. The question is whether that will offset Nixon's strength in the counties outside. And Nixon is running extremely strongly in the counties outside. Here's another one for Maryland, which puts Nixon a little farther ahead, 284,000 to Kennedy's 277,000. Looking down at Maine, Nixon's ahead. Delaware, he's ahead. Connecticut, he's won. So the picture in the East is beginning to gel, Walter.
We have a report from Louisiana that it has switched over in the scattered returns from that southern state to the Nixon column again. Wyoming also has been heard from for the first time this evening to go into the Nixon column, although Missouri has switched over to Kennedy. With 13% of the precincts counted now, that's an addition of precincts. We were at 12% a little while ago. We now have 13. Kennedy has, as you see there, 5,337,000 to Nixon's 4,740,000 votes. So Kennedy has almost moved into a 600,000 vote lead. In the electoral vote, with the changes I just gave you, Missouri is still in the Kennedy column. It shows Kennedy 328 electoral votes to Nixon's 188. The percentage has not changed, 47% for Nixon and 53% for Kennedy. Ohio has just switched over to the Kennedy column. It did just before you looked at those returns to make it that 328 with its 25 electoral votes. Eric Severide, how is this thing going in your books?
Walter, it's the most unprecedented kind of election, quite obviously. And one of the, not the least of the extraordinary events has been the appearance in what is really a campaign speech by the President of the United States on election night itself, because, of course, of the time difference. The important thing, obviously, is that Kennedy is doing extremely well where it really counts, and that is in the big industrial states. The great flood of votes from New York State will start coming in heavily now, very soon. There's no great reason, judging by what happened in the neighboring and very similar states of Connecticut and Pennsylvania, why Kennedy should have any trouble at all in taking New York. And after all, the big industrial states in most elections tend to run together. They run in a pack. He's also running ahead of most of the expectations in the South, even though he's a Catholic and even though he's running on a very strong liberal civil rights platform. So Mr. Lyndon Johnson ought to be feeling at this point rather good about his own work in the southern states. These computer machines have been back and forth nearly all evening, giving us mostly what Sam Goldwyn used to call a definite maybe. But in the last hour or so, they have firmed up. They're all pretty confident now of a Kennedy victory. Historically, it ought to be pointed out that members of minority groups will tend to vote for a representative of a minority group, even of a different minority group. than this seems to be happening on this religious matter. One thing, of course, is sure, that is both the House and the Senate will be Democratic when this election is over and the new Congress takes place. So if Kennedy wins, he has his own party to work with all the way down the line. Whether he wins or not is something we can only guess at on the basis of what's been said by the machines and the estimates. All of them now saying a Kennedy victory. All right, back to you, Walter.
Right, Eric, and the United Press now gives Oklahoma to Vice President Nixon, declaring Oklahoma in the Nixon column. On the popular vote, we have posted 14% of the vote now. Kennedy 5,527,000, Nixon 4,905,000. Time now for Betty Furness and an item of interest from Westinghouse.
Well, right now, Walter, Westinghouse is out hunting for all old refrigerators like this that are too small and too cramped and just not big enough or good enough. Yes, these old refrigerators are wanted for trade-in today. There'll never be a better time to retire your old refrigerator than now, when Westinghouse is announcing this new Westinghouse Deluxe Cold Injector Refrigerator with separate home freezer. Just look, room up here for over 100 pounds of frozen foods. With all that capacity, you can take full advantage of food sales. Stock up on fruit juices, vegetables, meats, and ice cream when prices are low. And here, in the big refrigerator section, is the amazing new Westinghouse Meat Keeper. Now, its roomy drawer, you can keep 10 full pounds of meats, even hamburger, store fresh for 7 days without freezing. While down here, in these twin vegetable crispers, your vegetables will stay garden fresh and crispy for many, many days. So even if your family is large, you need market just once a week. Just think of the time and trouble and money you can save. See it for yourself. And remember, this big new Westinghouse Deluxe Cold Injector Refrigerator, like all 1960 Westinghouse refrigerators, has earned the famous Good Housekeeping magazine guarantee seal. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
We just heard from Vermont that Congressman William R. Meyer, the first Democratic congressman in the past 100 years in that rock-ribbed Republican state of Vermont, has conceded his defeat tonight by Governor Robert T. Stafford for the only congressional seat from Vermont. So the one congressional seat from Vermont returns to the Republican column in this 1960 election. We now have 15% of our precincts on the board, 5,775,000 for Kennedy, 5,116,000 for Vice President Nixon. And the percentage has now changed. Kennedy has moved far enough ahead in his margin to give him 54% of the votes to Nixon's 46. Paul Niven is with Len Hall, the Nixon campaign manager, in the Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel ballroom where Nixon has set up his election night headquarters. Come in, Paul Niven.
Mr. Hall, how do you interpret the returns we have so far?
Well, I don't think you can place any real interpretation on it. As I said last night in a broadcast, in my opinion, this election is going to be decided by who wins a majority of these states: Texas, California, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and New York. And I don't think there's anything yet that has been shown which will indicate just who is going to carry a majority of those states.
The electronic computers, as you know, are now showing heavy odds on a Kennedy victory. I take it you disagree.
Well, I've been listening to the electronic computer, and I've heard it go from 6 to 1 to 20 to 1, back to 15 to 1, and so on. I think we should put all of those electronic computers in the junk pile so far as election returns are concerned.
Of course, the vice president expected Kennedy to pile up a big majority in the East. Did he not?
That's right. I think it was expected that Mr. Kennedy do just what he did in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. But these big states aren't in, and I would say this, Paul, I think we all better get some cots and stay here. I think this is going down to the wire. It's a squeaker, and we're going to be here for a long while.
Mr. Hall, one more point. There's been a lot of reports already about polarization on the religious issue. Catholic districts going heavily for Kennedy, Protestant districts going heavily for Nixon. Do you see that yourself?
I haven't any comment on that because I haven't seen enough to indicate. I think this is a real close election. We all said it would be a close one. And by the way, Paul, coming out on the plane Someone took a poll of those on the plane with me. We just got here, and it was Nixon 61, Kennedy 21. So wait for these returns to come into the big states, and it's going to be a Nixon victory.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leonard Hall. This is Paul Niven in the staff room at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles.
Thank you. Well, apparently, Vice President Nixon's going to get the airplane vote anyway, according to Len Hall. But in the rest of the country, Senator Kennedy is still running ahead and has increased his margin to 54%, as we said. Although after we reported that 54, to show you how close this race is, it dropped down to 53 again, but popped back to 54 at this moment. With 16% of the precincts in now, Kennedy has 6,093,000 votes to Nixon's 5,380,000, and in the electoral vote, that would give Kennedy, if he carries all the states where he's now leading, 328 electoral votes, Nixon 188 electoral votes. Let's check in with the Middle Western section of the country, now with Stuart Noven giving us a guiding hand. Stuart?
All right, Walter, it's a faltering hand because these returns keep going back and forth in many of the states, but there are some now where we've got some trends. In Illinois, the City News Bureau, which covers the Chicago and Cook County area, reports that Kennedy should take the Illinois, the whole state, by a 90 to 100,000 lead. Cook County should give him about 70% of the state's votes, which means if that survey is correct and that projection is right, it means that Kennedy will take Illinois. That still, however, is one to watch. In Indiana, we feel that Nixon has been elected. The 13 electoral votes go into the Nixon column. This includes parts of Marion County, Indianapolis, Lake County, Geary and Hammond, Democratic areas where there is very high unemployment. Nixon was predicted to carry the state by perhaps 200,000 votes, and he appears on the basis of the number of precincts now reporting to be well on his way with little chance of his being overtaken. Another place where we feel Nixon has been elected is in Kansas, and you can see the votes that are going up now. Wichita and Kansas City have not yet reported in, but Kennedy needed, in order to overtake the Nixon lead, Kennedy needed to get 65% of Topeka, Kansas City, and Wichita. He lost enough in Topeka so that he cannot make it up, and that puts 8 electoral votes from Kansas in the Nixon list. In Missouri, we have a situation with 14% of the votes counted, which shows a real horse race in this state. In spite of the fact that Kennedy appears to be ahead of Nixon at the moment, that has been going back and forth, and it's one which we certainly would not want to call at this stage of the game. One more election in Oklahoma. Nixon is considered far ahead. The Democratic votes are already in, and the 8 electoral votes of Oklahoma go to the Republicans. That's it as of now.
In the popular vote, Kennedy now has 6,317,000, Nixon 5,588,000 with 16% of the precincts counted. Iowa has gone back into the Republican column with its 10 electoral votes. Maryland, however, has dropped back into the Kennedy column, as has Ohio at the moment, to give Kennedy 337 electoral votes and Nixon 179. With me here is our man who has been making himself an expert on the composition of the 1961 Congress, the 87th Congress. How does it look, George?
Well, it's a commentary on the perversity of the American people, I suppose, that when President Eisenhower was asking for a Republican Congress in '58, he got a biggest Democratic sweep ever. Now that Senator Kennedy seems to be leading, the Democrats are losing. At the moment, I count 11 seats that I believe the Democrats have lost. I count none of the doubtful seats that the Republicans have lost. And I might add that almost all the Democratic seats that are being lost are young liberals who came in the big liberal sweep of 1958. As far as the Senate's concerned, it's a little hard to tell at this point. It seems to me that its composition is exactly the same as before, with the exception that Senator Kennedy seems to be pulling in his friend from Massachusetts, Mayor O'Connor, and old-timer Senator Saltonstall at the moment looks like he's in trouble. So at the moment, the Senate balance looks like it's going to be almost exactly as it was before when you count Vice President Lyndon Johnson pulling out.
I was going to say, we do have an interesting situation there, that if this Democratic ticket wins tonight, there will be 2 vacancies in the Democratic side of the Senate thanks to a victory here in November.
And another interesting thing, when Senator Johnson pulls out, he's going to leave a lot of very major committee chairmanships vacant. And there's going to be a quick scramble, which is going to mean a change in the nature of the Interior Committee, that very important committee which governs what Senator Kennedy likes to call the new starts. It looks to me like after they've all made their choices, Senator Henry Jackson of Washington, a very liberal, very pro-public power man, is going to be chairman of Interior, and that means a lot of new starts will be welcomed by that committee if they're suggested by the president.
George, I was just checking in my record book here and noticed that since the Civil War, only 4 presidents have failed to carry enough House seats in a presidential election to register gains for their party at that time. And they were McKinley, Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Eisenhower. So Kennedy, if he wins tonight and does lose some seats in the House, will go down in the record books anyway.
Well, you're a little older than I am on the statistics, Walter, but I think this is just a reaction from the extremely liberal sweep of '58.
Right. Thank you, George. Right. We'll be checking back in on the congressional races and those excellent reports of yours a little later on. Now let's take a moment to listen to Betty Furness, who brings us another bit of news from Westinghouse for homemakers all over the country.
Well, it's really a question, Walter. How would you like to make today the last day you ever wash and dry dishes? Well, you can, easily and economically. How? Tomorrow, with absolutely no installation cost or fuss, you can begin enjoying this wonderful new Westinghouse roll-about dishwasher in your home. It needs no plumbing, no special wiring, no installation. Just plug it in, snap the hose onto your sink faucet. Now, the water comes in here and drains out here. And the Westinghouse Rollabout is the only dishwasher that heats its own water with a built-in hot water booster that positively assures 140-degree hot water. What's more, the actual washing doesn't start until the water has reached 140 degrees. And of course, the hotter the water, the cleaner the dishes. The Westinghouse Rollabout dishwasher also features this exclusive new faucet connector that lets you drain aerated hot water for cleaning or cold water for drinking, even while the dishwasher is operating. Now, only Westinghouse has it. Dishwashing through, a convenient reel automatically rewinds the electric cord. Truly, the Westinghouse Rollabout offers everything that you could want in an automatic dishwasher, and you can start enjoying sparkling clean dishes like this tomorrow with no dishwasher installation. See it tomorrow at your Westinghouse dealer. The wonderful Westinghouse Rollabout dishwasher. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
And there's the popular vote with more than 17% of the precincts counted. Kennedy 6,651,000, Nixon 5,897,000. Doug Edwards, how are those 6 key states going?
Well, Walter, let's look at New York first. Most of the vote, of course, is coming in right now from upstate New York. We have, for instance, complete returns from Rome, and they give Kennedy a victory of 10,000, roughly 350, over Nixon with 7,580. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Rome has voted right every time in this century in presidential races, except in 1916 and 1932, and then it was wrong by only 125 votes. In Syracuse, that also is going at the moment for Kennedy. This particular city has been rocked recently by local scandals involving the GOP city administration. 2% of the vote in, however, and only 2% from New York as of now. Pennsylvania, we still haven't heard very much from the predominantly Republican counties outside of Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh. You heard the details generally on Ohio and Illinois from Stuart Novins. That's the way the big states, with the exception of California. Nothing indicated there really yet. Much too early. That's the picture, Walter.
Interesting sidelight on this election. President Eisenhower, voting for the last time as President of the United States at his home in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania this morning, commented to the horde of newsmen who watched him cast that historic vote that they would not be nearly so interested in his next vote in a presidential election. Well, about the same time, former President Harry Truman, who has been out of office for 8 years, was voting out in Independence, Missouri, and there were no newspapermen present, only 3 photographers. We'll be continuing our national election coverage, and now let's pause for the latest local returns across the nation. In the meantime, for those of you still with us here in New York, let's go down to Washington and take a look at the Well, we thought we were going down for the Democratic headquarters down there, but we'll come back there a little bit later. Meanwhile, let's check in with Grant Holcomb out on the western board.
Well, Walter, we have three fairly good sets of figures here from Arizona, from Colorado, and from New Mexico. Let's start first with Arizona because we have 13% of the vote in. Now, when 13% of the vote was in 4 years ago, President Eisenhower was leading Adlai Stevenson. He had approximately 41,000 votes at that time. President Eisenhower. Adlai Stevenson had 23,000. The votes here in Arizona have been coming from the Phoenix area in Maricopa County. It's been acknowledged by the Kennedy people in Arizona that if they lose Maricopa County by more than 15,000 votes, they're going to have trouble in the outlying counties. As yet, we haven't had any reports in Arizona from the Tucson area, but they'll be coming along in just a few moments. This vote, again, is interesting because Arizona as a state has never voted for a losing presidential candidate. Well, let's move down 2 panels now to the state of Colorado. Colorado has 6 electoral votes, and we have just 1% of the vote in at the present time. These votes are from in and around the Denver area. Denver County is expected to be a toss-up county. Nixon leading Kennedy. In 1956, President Eisenhower was leading at this time of the evening in Colorado, in Denver County, was leading Adlai Stevenson by approximately 2-1. Colorado does not have an expert record as a state voting with the winning candidate. It has voted wrong 4 times. A couple of times with Bryan at the turn of the century. It voted for Wendell Willkie, and it voted for Dewey. Now, let's move on down several panels to New Mexico because the votes are beginning to come in from the New Mexico area. And we find that this figure is an interesting one because it's from the Albuquerque area. It's from the Heights area in Albuquerque. It's not at all surprising because that is an area that the professionals in New Mexico figured would go Republican. That the vote that everybody is waiting for in the New Mexico area is the vote that comes along the eastern part of the state, a portion of the state that is called Little Texas. That's the one where the experts so far, up until the closing of the polls, claim that they just didn't know how it was going to go because of a religious issue in that area that they call Little Texas. So New Mexico's 4 electoral votes with just a very small percentage in there in the Nixon column at the moment. But those votes are from the Albuquerque area, from the Heights area in and around Albuquerque, and they are not at all surprising or upsetting to the Kennedy people. It might be interesting to note, too, that New Mexico has never voted for a losing presidential candidate. We've got just a second, so let's move back over to Arizona and take a look at that gubernatorial race in Arizona because we do have some late returns on that one. And the Republican incumbent, Paul Fannin, is leading in Arizona. Again, Lee Ackerman, the Democratic candidate, is under the impression that he certainly cannot lose in Maricopa County by more than 15,000 and have any hope of winning the state. Well, that's pretty much the situation in the western part of the country at this hour.
Stay tuned for more election returns on the CBS television network.